nobody had Anne's name on their list. When speculation about Charles's health surged again in early 2026, everyone was focused on William, on the timing of the transition, on how soon a King William reign might begin. Then Charles made one announcement that stopped all of it cold. He was naming a Royal Regent, not William, Anne. After 50 years of service, she had never chased the spotlight, never positioned herself for power. So why her, and why now? Charles had just placed the most significant constitutional role a royal can hold short of the crown itself in her hands. What does William think about it? The decision that rewrote the rules. The word regent carries serious weight. It is not an honorary title. It is not a ceremonial distinction handed out to reward decades of loyal service. It is a constitutional role with real operational authority. A regent acts on behalf of the monarch when the monarch cannot act for themselves. They sign off on legislation. They receive visiting heads of state. They carry the full formal authority of the crown in every situation that requires it. Britain has had regents before. The most famous is the Prince of Wales, who governed in place of King George III, during the periods when the king's mental illness made it impossible for him to function. That regency lasted nearly a decade and shaped an entire era of British history so completely that the period still carries the regent's name. This is not a minor administrative arrangement. This is the backup engine of the British state. The legal framework governing regency in modern Britain is the Regency Act of 1937, updated in 1943 and again in 1953. Under that framework, if the monarch becomes incapacitated, the role of regent passes automatically to the next person in the line of succession, who is over 21 years of age and meets the relevant residency and citizenship requirements. That person is William, which is precisely what makes Charles's announcement so striking. He did not follow the automatic provision. He used a separate mechanism available to the monarch, a formal declaration supported by specific royal instruments that allows the sovereign to designate a counselor of state or a specific individual to act with regency-level authority under defined circumstances. He chose Anne, and that choice requires explanation. Counselors of state are not unusual in the British system. When the monarch travels abroad or is temporarily unable to carry out duties, a small group of senior royals is authorized to handle routine matters on their behalf. Currently, that group includes Camilla, William, Harry, Andrew, and Beatrice, though Harry and Andrew's roles have been effectively suspended given their respective situations. What Charles has done is different from a standard counselor arrangement. He has created a specific designated authority for Anne that sits above the routine counselor framework and applies to a defined set of circumstances connected to his ongoing medical situation, not the full regency that would apply if he became permanently incapacitated, something more targeted, more operational. Designed for the periods when his treatment requires him to step back from active decision-making without triggering the full constitutional machinery of a permanent succession. In plain language, he has created a role for Anne that did not previously exist in this specific form, tailored to his situation, authorized by him, and carrying his full constitutional backing. The palace's announcement was careful in its language, as these announcements always are. It described the arrangement as a formalization of existing support structures designed to ensure continuity of royal duties during periods of medical management. It referenced Anne's decades of experience and her unique position within the royal family as factors in the decision. It noted that the arrangement had been made with the full knowledge and agreement of senior members of the royal household. That last phrase was doing considerable work. Full knowledge and agreement covers a wide range of actual responses. It means nobody was legally blindsided. It does not mean everybody was pleased. Royal watchers who have spent years reading palace statements parsed that language immediately and drew their own conclusions about what full knowledge and agreement was carefully not saying. The constitutional implications extend beyond the immediate situation. A named regent, even a partial and targeted one, creates precedent. It establishes that Charles considered his son's automatic succession to regent status insufficient for the circumstances he was managing, that he looked at William and decided, for reasons the announcement does not fully articulate, that someone else was better suited to the specific role he needed filled right now. That is a significant statement. Even wrapped in careful institutional language, even framed as a practical medical management decision rather than a judgment about William's readiness. The subtext is clear to anyone inside the system. Charles looked at his options. He chose his sister. Anne's reaction to the announcement has been described by sources close to her as characteristically understated. She did not give interviews. She did not release a personal statement expressing gratitude or humility or any of the other emotions the occasion might conventionally be expected to produce. She accepted the role the way she has accepted every role across 50 years of royal service. She got on with it. Within 48 hours of the announcement, she had been briefed by palace officials on the specific scope of her authority, the circumstances under which it would be activated, and the administrative structures that would support her in carrying it out. She asked detailed questions. She requested specific documentation. She wanted to understand exactly what she was being asked to do and exactly how it would work in practice. No ceremony, no performance. Just a woman who has spent 5 decades preparing for whatever the institution needed from her, being handed something significant and responding with the same efficiency she brings to everything else. But beneath the institutional calm of how Anne received the role and how the palace announced it, something genuinely significant had just happened. The line of succession had not changed. William remains heir to the throne. His path to kingship is unaltered by this decision. But the path to kingship and the distribution of current operational authority are two different things. And Charles had just made clear, in the most formal constitutional way available to him, that the person he trusted to hold his authority when he could not hold it himself was not his son, it was his sister. Understanding why requires understanding something about both of them, about what Charles sees in Anne that he does not yet fully see in William, about what this moment reveals about the state of the relationship between a king and his heir at one of the most consequential periods in the modern monarchy's history. That is exactly where we are going next. Why Anne and not William? The question every royal commentator reached for first was the obvious one. Why not William? He is the heir. He has been accumulating authority inside the palace for 2 years. He has handled the Andrew crisis, reshaped the Duchy of Cornwall, taken on briefings that would previously have gone to Charles alone. By every visible measure, the transition toward a King William reign has been accelerating steadily and deliberately. So, why, when Charles needed someone to hold his authority formally and constitutionally, did he look past his son and choose his sister? The answer has several layers, and none of them are simple. The first layer is practical. Anne has no competing agenda. That sounds straightforward. It is actually the most important factor in Charles's decision, and the one that gets discussed least in public coverage of this situation. William is the future king. Everything he does, every decision he makes, every relationship he builds inside the palace carries the weight of that future. He cannot be involved in current royal decisions without those decisions being read by everyone around him through the lens of what kind of king he intends to be. That is not a criticism of William. It is simply the reality of his position. He is simultaneously the present heir and the future monarch, and those two roles create a tension that cannot be fully resolved until the succession actually happens. Anne has no such tension. She will never be queen. She has no succession interest. When she acts as regent, she acts purely on Charles's behalf, with no personal stake in the outcome of any decision she makes. Her authority is borrowed, temporary, and entirely oriented towards serving the current reign rather than shaping the next one. That purity of purpose is genuinely valuable in a regent, and it is something William, through no fault of his own, cannot currently offer. The second layer is experience. Anne has been doing versions of this work for 50 years. She has stood in for the monarch at official functions more times than any other senior royal. She has received visiting heads of state, attended Privy Council meetings, represented the Crown at events across Britain and internationally, with a consistency and reliability that the palace has depended on without always publicly acknowledging. She understands the machinery, not theoretically, operationally. She knows which decisions require which levels of authorization. She knows which officials to consult and in what order. She knows the protocols that govern how the Crown interacts with the government, with the judiciary, with foreign powers. William knows these things too, increasingly, but knowing them and having spent decades practicing them are different. Anne does not need to be brought up to speed on anything. She already knows. That saves time and reduces risk in a situation where Charles needs someone who can step in without a learning curve. The third layer is trust, and this is where the explanation becomes more personal. Charles and Anne have a relationship that is different in kind from his relationship with his sons. They grew up together inside an institution that demanded everything from both of them and offered very little in return in terms of ordinary family warmth. They watched the same parents navigate the impossible tension between being a royal family and being a family. They absorbed the same lessons about duty and silence and the particular discipline required to carry a title that belongs to history as much as it belongs to you. That shared formation created a bond between them that neither of them talks about publicly, but that people close to both have described as one of the most genuinely solid relationships inside the royal family. Charles trusts Anne in the way you trust someone who has been in the same difficult room with you for 70 years. Not because she has never disagreed with him, she has, frequently and directly, but because he knows exactly who she is and how she operates and what she will do when the pressure is real. He cannot say that about everyone. The fourth layer involves William directly, and it is the most sensitive. Charles loves his son. That is not in question. His investment in preparing William for kingship, the deliberate transfer of authority over the past 2 years, the decision to grant William and Catherine the right to issue royal warrants, all of it reflects a father genuinely committed to setting his son up to succeed. But love and complete confidence are not the same thing. William is still forming as a future monarch. He has strong instincts, clear values, and genuine capability. He also has, in the view of people close to Charles, a tendency toward decisiveness that occasionally outpaces consultation. A willingness to move fast and establish facts on the ground, as he did at the Duchy of Cornwall, that is admirable in many contexts and potentially complicated in others. A regent acting on behalf of an ill king needs to be someone who will hold the line exactly where Charles drew it, not someone who might, with the best intentions, use the temporary authority to advance their own agenda for the institution even incrementally. Charles did not doubt William's intentions. He had questions about William's restraint. Anne has never had a restraint problem in her life. There is also the question of Camilla. This is the layer that is spoken about least publicly and understood most clearly by people inside the palace. William and Camilla's relationship has been strained for months. The conflict over Sarah Ferguson, the friction over Kate's rising role, the Sandringham Shield legal battle that resulted in Anne securing protections William's camp had resisted. A regency that passed to William would have placed Camilla in an extremely complicated position, her husband incapacitated, her stepson holding his authority, and the relationship between them already carrying significant tension. Charles was aware of that dynamic, acutely so. Appointing Anne sidesteps it entirely. Anne's relationship with Camilla is cordial but distant, professional rather than warm. There is no history of significant conflict between them, and no live tensions that a regency appointment would inflame. It was the cleanest option available, and Charles, whatever his health situation, remains a man who thinks carefully about which problems he needs to solve and which ones he can simply choose not to create. William received the news 24 hours before the public announcement. Charles told him personally. The conversation has been described by sources as direct and relatively brief. Charles explained his reasoning. He emphasized that the decision reflected the specific circumstances of his medical situation and was not a judgment on William's fitness for kingship. He was clear that the path to succession was unchanged and that the regency arrangement was temporary and defined in scope. William listened, asked questions, did not express objection in the conversation itself. What happened after the conversation ended is a different story, and it is the story that reveals most clearly what this decision actually cost inside the family. The moment Charles made it official. The announcement came on a Wednesday morning in April 2026, not through a leaked briefing the night before, not through the usual process of tipping off senior royal correspondents so the story could be framed favorably before it broke publicly. The palace released a formal written statement at 10 o'clock in the morning, and every outlet received it simultaneously. That decision, to release without pre-briefing, was itself a signal. Pre-briefing allows friendly journalists to frame a story before hostile ones can react to it. Simultaneous release means the palace was not worried about hostile framing. It means they were confident enough in the decision and its public reception that they did not need to manage the narrative in advance. They released it clean and let it land. The statement ran to 4 paragraphs. The first confirmed that King Charles had made a formal declaration under the relevant provisions of the Regency Act designating Princess Anne as the senior counselor of state with extended authority to act on behalf of the monarch during defined periods of medical management. The second outlined the scope of that authority: legislative matters requiring royal assent, reception of diplomatic credentials from visiting ambassadors and heads of state, Privy Council attendance and formal approvals, the specific categories of royal function that could not simply be deferred but required someone with constitutional authority to execute them when Charles was unavailable. The third paragraph noted that the arrangement had been made with the full support of the royal household and in consultation with His Majesty's government. The fourth was a single sentence: Princess Anne has served the crown with distinction for more than 50 years, and His Majesty has complete confidence in her to discharge these responsibilities with the dedication and discretion she has demonstrated throughout her royal life. The government's response came within the hour. The Prime Minister's office released a brief statement expressing full support for the arrangement and confidence in Princess Anne's ability to fulfill the role. The leader of the opposition followed shortly after with a similarly supportive statement. That bipartisan speed was not accidental. The palace had briefed the government the previous evening, not the press, but the government. The Prime Minister and relevant senior ministers had known since Tuesday night, which gave them time to prepare coordinated responses and ensure that the political establishment presented a unified front when the public announcement hit. The last thing the palace needed was any suggestion of political discomfort with the decision. Securing advanced government alignment removed that risk entirely. Inside Buckingham Palace, the morning of the announcement was described by staff as unusually tense, not chaotic. The palace does not visibly cause chaos, but tense in the specific way that large institutions get tense when something significant is happening and people at different levels of the hierarchy have different amounts of information about what it means. Junior staff knew what the statement said. Senior officials knew more about the conversations that had preceded it. A small number of people at the very top of the household structure knew everything, including the details of Charles's medical situation that had made the decision necessary and the internal family conversations that had shaped who was chosen. That gradation of knowledge created a particular atmosphere. People moving through the building with questions they were not sure they were allowed to ask, reading the faces of colleagues who might know more, trying to gauge from small signals what the full picture looked like. Anne was at Buckingham Palace when the statement was released. She had arrived that morning for a previously scheduled series of meetings that now carried considerably more significance than their original purpose. She was briefed in detail by the palace's legal and constitutional advisors on the precise scope of her authority and the administrative mechanisms through which it would be exercised. The briefing lasted 2 hours. Staff who were present describe her as engaged and precise throughout. She asked about edge cases, situations where the boundaries of her authority might be unclear, what the escalation process was if a decision arose that she considered outside the scope of what she had been designated to handle, how communication with Charles would work during periods when the Regency authority was active. She wanted to understand the system completely before she operated within it. That is consistent with everything known about how she approaches responsibility. When the briefing ended, she thanked the advisors, confirmed her understanding of the arrangements, and moved directly to her next meeting. No speech, no moment of visible reflection, just the next item on the schedule. The public reaction came in waves. The first wave, within minutes of the statement's release, was surprising, pure, and simple. Nobody outside the palace's inner circle had seen this coming. Royal commentators, who spend their professional lives tracking signals and reading institutional tea leaves, admitted openly that this one had not been on their radar. The second wave was curiosity. What does this actually mean? How does it work? What can Anne do, and what can she not do? News outlets scrambled to find constitutional experts who could explain the Regency Act's provisions in terms accessible to a general audience. Most of those experts were, themselves, slightly surprised by the specific mechanism Charles had used. The third wave was opinion. and here the reaction split in ways that reflected the public's complicated feelings about the royal family more broadly. Older audiences, those who had followed Anne's career across decades, responded with something close to satisfaction, a recognition that someone who had given as much as she had was being formally acknowledged in a way that matched her actual contribution. Younger audiences were more focused on the implications for William. Social media filled quickly with questions about what the decision said about the heir's relationship with his father, and whether it signaled something more significant about William's standing than the palace statement acknowledged. Camilla's public response was visible in its absence. She had no scheduled engagements on the day of the announcement. She did not appear publicly. No statement was released on her behalf. No palace spokesman addressed questions about her reaction. She was, in the precise language of royal communications management, unavailable for comment. That unavailability was itself a comment, loudly understood by anyone who had been following the internal dynamics of the palace over the preceding months. The woman who had spent 30 years navigating her way to the center of the British royal family watched her husband hand a constitutionally significant role to his sister on a Wednesday morning and had nothing to say about it publicly. What she had to say privately was, by all accounts, considerably more. Charles made one further gesture on the day of the announcement that has not been widely reported, but which sources describe as deliberate and meaningful. He sent Anne a handwritten note, not an email, not a message passed through a private secretary, a handwritten note delivered by hand to her office at Buckingham Palace on the afternoon of the announcement. Its contents have not been disclosed. Sources describe it as personal rather than formal, something between a brother and a sister rather than between a king and his newly appointed regent. Anne read it, folded it, and put it on her desk. She has not discussed its contents with anyone who has been willing to share them, but people who know her well say that she kept it, and that for Anne, who does not keep things sentimentally as a rule, that fact alone says something about what it contained. William's response and the tension it created. William was at Kensington Palace when the public announcement dropped. He had known it was coming. Charles had told him the previous day. He had 24 hours to process the information privately before the rest of the world found out. Those 24 hours were not easy ones. Sources close to William described the period between Charles's conversation with him and the public announcement as one of the most difficult he has navigated since the transition of power accelerated. Not because he was blindsided, he was not, but because knowing something is coming and sitting with what it means are two different experiences. He sat with it. His public response was impeccable. That needs to be said clearly because it is genuinely significant. Whatever William felt privately about his father's decision, what he presented publicly was complete and correct support. He did not brief against the decision. He did not allow anyone in his circle to be quoted, even anonymously, expressing reservations. He did not deploy the subtle signals of royal displeasure, the canceled appearances, the pointed absences, the carefully worded non-endorsements that experienced royal watchers know how to read. He released a brief statement through Kensington Palace expressing his full support for the arrangement and his confidence in Princess Anne's ability to carry out the role. The statement was warm, specific about Anne's qualifications, and completely devoid of any language that could be read as anything other than genuine endorsement. William understands optics. He understood that any visible resistance to his father's decision would damage him more than the decision itself. A future king who cannot gracefully accept a temporary constitutional arrangement made by the current king is not someone who inspires confidence in their readiness to reign. He played it exactly right publicly. Privately was a different landscape. Sources describe a series of conversations in the days following the announcement that revealed the genuine complexity of William's position, with Catherine first. That conversation happened the evening of the announcement, after the public statements had been made and the immediate media cycle had been managed. Behind closed doors at Kensington Palace, Catherine's role in that conversation has been described as stabilizing. She did not minimize what had happened or pretend it was straightforward. She acknowledged the difficulty of it directly, but she also, according to sources, helped William identify quickly what the decision was and what it was not. It was not a rejection. It was not a statement about his fitness to be king. It was a specific, bounded, medically driven decision made by a man who loves his son and also knows his sister, and made a practical judgment about which of them was better suited to a particular temporary role. Catherine framed it that way. William, by the following morning, was operating from that frame. The more complicated conversations were with his own team. William's senior advisors had been building toward a model of the transition that assumed his authority would continue to expand steadily and visibly until the succession occurred. The Regency announcement did not derail that model fundamentally, but it introduced a variable they had not planned for and did not entirely welcome. An Anne Regency, even a partial and defined one, creates a period where the public face of royal authority is not William, where decisions are made and actions are taken under a name that is not his, where the momentum of the transition toward King William pauses, however briefly, and the institution reminds everyone that it operates on its own terms and its own timeline. That pause is not catastrophic, but it is not nothing either. Senior members of William's team expressed their discomfort through the channels available to them, not publicly. Inside the household, in conversations with palace officials, in the careful language of institutional concern rather than personal objection, the message they were communicating was straightforward. They wanted clarity on the duration and scope of the arrangement. They wanted assurance that it would not expand beyond what the announcement had outlined. And they wanted a clear sense of what the pathway looked like from the current arrangement back to the accelerating transition they had been managing. The tension with Camilla added another dimension that William had not fully anticipated. Camilla's reaction to the announcement was, privately, one of the most pointed responses in the palace. She had not been consulted in any meaningful way about the decision. She had been informed, as William had, but not consulted. Her view had not been sought and would not have changed the outcome if it had been. She understood that. She also found it difficult to accept. Her position inside the palace had been narrowing for months. The ceremony where the crown was placed on Catherine's head, the Sandringham Shield decision that gave Anne legally protected access to an estate Camilla had considered secure ground. And now this. Her husband chose his sister over his son, and neither choice centering Camilla's in any way. She was becoming peripheral inside an institution she had spent 30 years becoming central to. That process was not complete. She retained her title and her official role, but the direction of travel was unmistakable. William was aware of Camilla's reaction and did not find it uncomplicated. On one hand, her marginalization was something his camp had been engineering deliberately in certain respects. The Duchess of Cornwall payroll changes, the alignment with palace officials who prioritized the next reign over the current one, the steady accumulation of authority that inevitably came at the expense of those connected to the era being left behind. On the other hand, watching his father's wife become visibly isolated inside the palace his father still occupied was not something William could feel entirely comfortable with. He kept that discomfort private, but it was there. The relationship between William and Anne in the aftermath of the announcement was, perhaps surprisingly, warmer than some had expected. Anne had not sought this role. She had not positioned herself for it or maneuvered toward it. She had been asked by her brother, and she had said yes in the same spirit. She says yes to everything the institution asks of her. William knew that, and he knew Anne well enough to know that she would exercise the role with absolute fidelity to what Charles had designated and nothing beyond it. She was not going to use the Regency to expand her own influence. She was not going to make decisions that constrained William's future options. She was not going to become a power center that complicated the path to his kingship. She was going to do exactly what she was asked to do and stop the moment she was asked to stop. That knowledge made the arrangement livable for William in a way it might not have been if the choice had been someone else. He called Anne privately 2 days after the announcement, and the conversation has been described by sources as genuine, not performative civility between royals managing a difficult situation. An actual conversation between two people who respect each other and who both understand what the institution is asking of them. Anne told him, directly, that she had no interest in being anything other than a bridge, her word, a bridge, between what Charles's reign had been and what William's reign would be. William accepted that, and the tension, while not gone, settled into something more manageable. The question that remained, and that nobody inside the palace could fully answer, was how long the bridge would need to hold. Charles's medical situation was being managed. That much was confirmed. What was not being shared publicly was the trajectory. whether the current phase of treatment represented stabilization or something more serious, whether the Regency arrangement was a temporary measure that would be wound back in months, or a permanent new feature of how the monarchy would function for the foreseeable future. William needed to know the answer to that question more than almost anyone, because his entire sense of where he was in the process of becoming king depended on it, and he did not yet have it. What this means for Britain and the monarchy's future. Britain has not had a functioning regent since the 19th century. That fact alone tells you how significant this moment is, not as a palace drama, not as royal family tension, as constitutional history. The Regency Act exists because the people who designed the British system understood something important. Monarchy is not a person, it is a continuity, an unbroken line of authority that cannot simply pause because the individual wearing the crown is temporarily unable to exercise it. Anne is that continuity right now. What this signals about Charles's health is the question nobody in the palace will answer directly. They do not need to. The decision answers it. Healthy monarchs managing routine medical situations do not activate Regency provisions. They use standard Counselor of State arrangements that have handled temporary royal absences for decades without constitutional fanfare. Charles went beyond that. He created something more formal, more specifically authorized, and more constitutionally robust than the standard framework requires. That tells you the situation is more serious than official communications have acknowledged. Not necessarily terminal, not necessarily a rapid deterioration, but serious enough that the man responsible for the continuity of the British state decided he needed something sturdier than routine arrangements to protect it. For Britain as a whole, the practical implications are limited in the short term. Anne will exercise the authority carefully and narrowly. She will not make policy. She will not use the role to shape decisions beyond the specific constitutional functions it covers. But symbolically, the implications are considerable. The country is watching a monarchy in active transition, not the clean ceremonial transition of a coronation where one reign ends and another begins with pageantry and clarity. A gradual, complicated, medically driven transition where authority is being redistributed in real time across multiple people simultaneously. That kind of transition tests institutions. It creates ambiguity about who is actually in charge and who speaks with final authority on any given day. The palace is managing that ambiguity as carefully as it can. Anne's appointment is part of that management. A clear, constitutionally grounded answer to the question of who holds authority when Charles cannot. For William, the road to kingship continues, unaltered in its destination, complicated in its immediate path. He will be king. That is not in question. But the timeline, the conditions, the state of the institution he inherits, all of it is being shaped by circumstances nobody fully controls. Anne holds the bridge. Charles made sure of that. And Britain, watching a 73-year-old princess step into one of the most significant constitutional roles the monarchy can offer, is seeing something it has not seen in a very long time. A royal family doing what it was designed to do. Surviving, adapting, continuing, whatever the cost. Charles had every conventional option available to him. He chose Anne, not the heir, not his wife, his sister, the one who never asked for anything, never sought the spotlight, and never once threatened to walk away from the institution she has served for 50 years. That choice says something about what Charles values at the hardest moment of his reign. And it says something about where the monarchy's real foundations actually sit when everything else gets complicated. Power does not always go to the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it goes to the one who simply never left.